There's a particular odor that those who work on oil rigs recognize when something goes awry. It strikes before the flames do, the scent of crude oil permeating the air all at once. Heavy and sharp, it resembles the interior of a furnace. Workers at the Fujairah oil industry zone on the eastern coast of the United Arab Emirates are well acquainted with that smell. This morning, March 14, 2026, they were reminded of it. Dark, thick columns of smoke were visible from miles away. Oil loading operations at the world's second-largest bunkering port have been halted. Millions of barrels of crude are now trapped in tanks that no ship can access. Meanwhile, across the Persian Gulf, the commanders of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, have already issued their latest warning. Jebel Ali Port in Dubai, Khalifa Port in Abu Dhabi, and any American presence in the Emirates are now considered legitimate targets. This is not an isolated incident. It is not a rogue strike in an otherwise stable region. What you are witnessing today is a direct, calculated, and deliberate response to a U.S. military operation that targeted Iran's oil infrastructure less than 24 hours ago. The action-reaction cycle in this conflict has now crossed a threshold it has not crossed before. The United States has reached into Iran's economic core, and Iran is retaliating through the UAE, sending shockwaves through the global oil market in real time. To comprehend what transpired today, we must revisit the beginning. 14 days ago, on February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a massive coordinated air campaign against Iran, dubbed Operation Epic Fury on the American side and Roaring Lion on the Israeli side. These strikes were not surgical. They were sweeping, targeting military infrastructure, air defense systems, and key leadership sites across Iran simultaneously. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, who had governed Iran's Islamic Republic for 37 years, was killed in his own compound in Tehran. His son, Mojtaba, was later designated as his successor. The Iranian government declared 40 days of national mourning and then began its counterattacks. Within hours of Khamenei's death being confirmed, Iran initiated what would become the most sustained campaign of missile and drone strikes in modern Middle Eastern history. These strikes were not limited to Israel or American bases. They targeted the entire architecture of U.S. presence in the Gulf: Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. The reasoning was straightforward and openly stated. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi declared that Iranian forces were targeting American bases and assets. The fact that those bases were located within sovereign Gulf states, in Iran's view, was the problem of those states. The UAE became, by nearly all measures, the most targeted country in this conflict outside of Iran itself. By early March, according to the UAE's own defense ministry, Iran had launched nearly 200 ballistic missiles and over 900 drones at the country. Most of these were intercepted, but when missiles are shot down over Dubai, the debris has to land somewhere. It struck residential areas near Zayed International Airport, near Palm Jumeirah, and near the Burj Al Arab. 6 people were killed, and over 130 were injured. The world's busiest international airport was hit by a drone. The U.S. consulate in Dubai caught fire, and Amazon data centers went dark, disrupting phone banking services across the country. A city built on the promise of security and luxury suddenly found itself waking up to the sound of air raid sirens. Amid all this chaos, a key question in energy markets was how long it would be before the strikes began affecting the infrastructure that actually transports oil. The Fujairah oil industry zone sits on the UAE's eastern coastline, outside the Strait of Hormuz. That geography is its entire strategic purpose. While the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow passage connecting the Persian Gulf to the open ocean, carries approximately 20% of the world's daily oil supply, Fujairah was constructed to serve as an escape route. The UAE built the Habshan-Fujairah pipeline, which runs oil overland from Abu Dhabi directly to Fujairah's East Coast terminals, bypassing the strait entirely. The port handles about 1 million barrels per day of the UAE's Murban crude, with a storage capacity exceeding 70 million barrels across 15 major tank farms. This makes it the world's second-largest bunkering hub after Singapore and one of the most critical refueling points for ships in the entire Indo-Pacific region, with roughly 40,000 vessels passing through Fujairah annually. This is precisely why Iran targeted it. Since the war began, Iran has been executing what analysts at the Sufan Center described as a strategy of raising costs, methodically striking not only military targets but also the economic infrastructure upon which America's Gulf allies and the broader global economy depend. Iran hit Qatar Energy's facility at Ras Laffan, the largest LNG production complex on Earth, forcing a production halt that sent natural gas prices soaring to a 3-year high. It attacked the Musafa fuel terminal in Abu Dhabi and the Bapco Energy's refinery in Bahrain. Drones were sent towards Saudi Aramco's Ras Tanura facility, one of the largest oil refineries on the planet, where a fire broke out from intercepted debris. Iran also targeted the ports of Duqm and Salalah in Oman, going after the very ports designed to handle oil flows in case the Strait of Hormuz was closed. This detail is crucial. Iran wasn't merely shooting at American bases. It was systematically attacking the alternatives, the exit ramps. If the Strait of Hormuz is the main highway, Fujairah and Salalah are the side roads. Tehran has been targeting both. Amid all this, something shifted this week that fundamentally changed the calculations. On Friday, March 13th, U.S. Central Command struck Iran's K Island. Trump himself announced the operation, posting a video of the strikes on Truth Social and stating that U.S. forces had obliterated Iranian military targets on the island. He was careful to add that oil infrastructure had been preserved for now, claiming he made that choice out of decency. However, he attached a condition. If Iran continued to interfere with the passage of ships through the Strait of Hormuz, he would reconsider. K Island is not just strategically significant, it is the structural core of Iran's entire economy. Located roughly 15 miles off Iran's southwestern coast in the Persian Gulf, K Island handles around 90% of Iran's oil exports. Every barrel Iran sells to China, Asia, or anywhere else moves through K Island. When Trump struck the island's military installations, he was not just targeting a base. He was standing over Iran's economic lifeline with his hand on the valve. Iran's response was immediate and unequivocal. The Iranian armed forces announced that any attack on Iranian oil and energy infrastructure would be met with strikes on energy facilities owned by American companies or those in which the U.S. holds shares anywhere in the region. The Iranian parliament speaker had warned just days earlier that strikes on Iran's southern maritime frontier would cause Tehran to abandon all restraint. Within hours of the K Island operation, the IRGC formally informed the UAE that American hideouts in the Emirates, including ports, docks, and military locations, were now legitimate targets. Civilians were instructed to evacuate. This morning, the fire at Fujairah followed. The Fujairah media office attributed the fire not to a direct drone impact, but to debris falling after an interception. That distinction is worth noting and should be taken seriously. UAE air defenses are among the most capable in the region, combining U.S.-supplied and Israeli-designed systems, and they have intercepted hundreds of projectiles throughout this conflict. Nevertheless, the effect on the ground remains the same, regardless of semantics. Oil storage tanks are ablaze and loading operations have been suspended. Analysts at RBC Capital, including Hale Limacroft, stated this morning that the IRGC is sending a clear message. There is no safe harbor in this conflict. Every port that handles oil, every terminal that ships energy, every dock where a ship might refuel, all of it is now within the orbit of this war. The market has already begun to price in what that means. When this war started on February 28th, Brent crude was trading at roughly $70 a barrel. Within days, it surged past $100. By early this week, the international benchmark had climbed more than 40% from pre-war levels. On Friday, following news of the K Island strikes, Brent closed above $100 for the second consecutive session. The IRGC threatened this week that oil prices could reach $200 a barrel. Goldman Sachs, in a note published midweek, raised its 2026 U.S. inflation forecast by nearly a full percentage point and trimmed its GDP forecast. It also increased its recession probability by 5 percentage points. Oxford Economics modeled a scenario where global crude averages $140 for 2 months, labeling it an economic breaking point that could push Europe, the UK, and Japan into contraction and bring the U.S. economy to a standstill. At the gas pump, Americans are already feeling the impact. The average price per gallon of gasoline has risen by more than 50 cents since the war began. That may sound modest, but it isn't. This price increase is not driven by seasonal demand or supply chain logistics. It's the result of the simple, inescapable mathematics of a global commodity market in which 20% of daily supply has been choked off, and the alternatives are catching fire one by one. Trump has repeatedly insisted that the United States is less affected by the Strait of Hormuz's closure than other countries, citing America's domestic production capacity. While it's true that the U.S. is not reliant on Persian Gulf oil for the majority of its imports, Mark Finley, a fellow at Rice University's Baker Institute, pointed out this week that because oil is a global market, if something goes wrong anywhere, the price rises everywhere. The U.S. is not insulated from a global supply shock due to its own production. It's simply less exposed than Japan, which receives 70% of its Middle Eastern oil through the Strait, or South Korea or Germany. Being less exposed does not equate to being immune. Moreover, oil is not the only commodity moving through that strait. 1/5 of global LNG trade transits the Strait of Hormuz, and 1/3 of global fertilizer trade does as well. Qatar Energy's Ras Laffan facility, which serves as the backbone of global LNG supply, has halted production. Urea prices, a key fertilizer input, have already skyrocketed from roughly $475 per metric ton to $680 in just a few days. The planting season for soybeans and corn in the American Midwest is approaching. If fertilizer shipments remain disrupted, food inflation will follow with a lag of several months. Supply chain companies have already identified petrochemical inputs, plastics, pharmaceuticals, rubber, and electronics components as secondary exposure areas. Shipping companies like Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd have suspended their Middle Eastern routes. Insurance premiums for vessels attempting to transit the strait have hit a 6-year high. The International Energy Agency, IEA, responded by ordering the largest emergency oil reserve release in history, 400 million barrels. For context, the largest previous release was 182.7 million barrels following Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Germany, Austria, and Japan have all confirmed they will draw down reserves. This is not a routine measure. It is an international triage operation. Amid all this, the Strait of Hormuz itself sits at the center of a dangerous standoff. The IRGC declared the strait closed on March 2nd. A senior IRGC commander publicly stated that any vessel attempting to pass would be set ablaze. At least 5 tankers have been damaged, and over 150 ships have anchored outside the strait to avoid attack. The IRGC warned this week that it would not allow a liter of oil to pass through the strait and threatened that prices could reach $200 a barrel. Trump threatened to strike Iran 20 times harder if the strait is not reopened, and discussed the possibility of U.S. forces taking control of the waterway, a proposal that legal experts immediately noted has no basis in international maritime law, as the strait passes through Iranian and Omani sovereign waters. On Tuesday, U.S. forces struck 16 Iranian mine-laying vessels near the strait. 2 Indian-flagged LNG carriers briefly passed through on Saturday, signaling a fragile possibility that selective passage may be feasible for some nations. However, for Western commercial shipping, the route remains effectively closed. The economic cost compounds with each passing day. The UAE is navigating a position that has become increasingly untenable. It is home to major U.S. military installations, including Al Dhafra Air Base and Al Minhad Air Base, the very facilities Iran has cited as justification for its strikes. Yet the UAE has not joined the war offensively. Its government has condemned Iran's attacks as violations of national sovereignty, withdrawn its ambassador from Tehran without severing ties entirely, and declined to retaliate militarily, with analysts noting that the Emirates cannot contribute anything to this fight that the Americans and Israelis do not already possess. The UAE's calculation is to absorb and deflect while preserving its reputation as a stable hub, even as that reputation is being tested in unprecedented ways. The cost to evacuate Dubai by private jet reached $250,000 on March 3rd. Hotels slashed prices to maintain occupancy, and schools shifted to remote learning. Oil production in the UAE decreased by between 500,000 and 800,000 barrels per day. The Emirate has arrested individuals for filming missile interceptions overhead, with some posting AI-generated fake damage videos that complicated the information environment. 60-year-old British tourists have been charged under cybercrime laws for photographing missiles in the sky. This is what life looks like in a city of 3.5 million people in the midst of a regional war. So, where does this situation go from here? There are three distinct trajectories this conflict could take, and only one of them appears genuinely stable. The first is the escalation ladder. The K-Island strike was the most consequential single U.S. escalation since the war began, fundamentally altering what Iran will accept. If the U.S. decides to strike K-Island's actual oil infrastructure, the pipelines, loading jetties, and storage tanks, it could eliminate between 1.5 and 1.7 million barrels of Iranian daily export capacity. According to J.P. Morgan estimates, Iran has vowed that any such attack will trigger a coordinated assault on every American-linked oil and energy facility in the Gulf. The fire at Fujairah today is not the ceiling. It is a signal of what comes next if escalation continues unchecked. Saudi Aramco's Ras Tanura, Abu Dhabi's ADNOC terminals, and any infrastructure connected to a U.S. company in the region are now fair targets according to Iran's stated doctrine. The second trajectory is a managed pause. There are fragile and unverified signals that diplomatic back channels remain open. Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, has not yet fully defined his military posture. Some Gulf states, including Qatar, have actively sought to facilitate a ceasefire. The UN Security Council is considering a resolution demanding that Iran halt its attacks on neighboring Gulf states. The GCC countries are increasingly calling for de-escalation, partly out of genuine concern for their populations and partly because they recognize that a prolonged war would undermine their economic model. Their political legitimacy hinges on achieving a managed pause, not a peace, but a ceasefire that freezes the situation while keeping all parties' grievances formally unresolved remains theoretically possible. However, this requires both sides to desire it. Currently, Iran has publicly stated that it sees no room for diplomacy after being struck while negotiations were underway. The third trajectory is a long grind. Even if the intensity of active combat decreases in the coming weeks, the structural damage to the global energy market has already been inflicted. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz, even if temporary, has exposed vulnerabilities that energy markets have regarded as theoretical risks for decades. The entire system is more fragile than previously suggested. Qatar Energy, halting LNG production, was not a hypothetical scenario. It actually happened. Saudi Aramco stating that continued warfare would yield drastic effects on the global economy was not a mere conjecture. It reflects operational reality. Insurance markets, shipping lanes, spare capacity assumptions, and reserve calculations are all being revised in real time. Even after this specific war concludes, premiums will remain elevated, routing patterns will change, and diversification investments that have been delayed for years will accelerate overnight. The architecture of global energy trade is being redesigned under fire. What occurred in Fujairah this morning is, in one sense, just one fire at one port on one day. In another sense, it represents the latest data point in a pattern that has been developing since February 28th. This is a pattern of systematic, deliberate targeting of the infrastructure that connects the world's energy supply to its demand. The exit ramps are being hit. The main highway is closed, reserves are being drawn down, and prices are moving in one direction. Trump struck K-Island, Iran struck Fujairah. The Strait of Hormuz is closed to most traffic, with Brent crude trading above $100. The IRGC has now advised residents of Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Fujairah to stay away from the ports. If you're watching this and wondering whether this crisis affects you, whether it matters beyond the headlines, consider this. Every 10% rise in global oil prices adds approximately 0.4% to inflation. According to IMF analysis, Brent has risen more than 40% in just 14 days. The fertilizer for the food you consume is stuck in supply chains that route through the Gulf. The electronics you purchase depend on components that travel those waters. The price at the pump is merely the most visible signal of a much deeper repricing that is working its way through every layer of the global supply chain. This war did not begin with Fujairah, and it will not end with it. The question is whether the involved parties, the U.S., Iran, Israel, and the Gulf states caught in between, can find a way to halt their escalation before one of them runs out of options. If you want to understand what comes next, whether Iran escalates further into Gulf infrastructure, whether the Hormuz standoff breaks or deepens, and what it means for your economy, subscribe and hit the bell. This is a story that does not pause when the cameras stop rolling.